Hi, I'm Hana Loftus. I'm co-director at HAT Projects. We're a really small architecture and planning practice based in Essex. We have a long association of working with artist studios as projects, and also, in fact, ourselves as a studio provider. And I thought it would be really nice to start today with the space that I'm sitting in fact, which is our own studio building, Trinity Works, in the middle of Colchester town centre. We bought this building about 4 years ago now, it was a 1970s church in actual fact, and we converted it into both our own studio and a cafe, and also some studio space, and specifically the largest space, the old church space that you can see here on the right, is now a makerspace. And I thought it would be interesting to start with this because it speaks to some of the contemporary concerns around artist practice and the space that's provided for artists. The makerspace model is essentially a membership model whereby you can pay a very small monthly fee to have access to the space and all the equipment in it. It focuses on ceramics and printing. So there are potter's wheels, there are kilns, there's screen printing equipment, letterpress equipment, Riso printer, and various other forms of printing equipment that you can use as a member. And really it's a way for artists who are starting out in their practice, or also are practitioners in those forms of art practice which do require quite a lot of expensive equipment or space hungry equipment, to be able to actually work and produce work when they wouldn't otherwise necessarily be able to afford to do that in their own space or with their own self-contained equipment. And also it provides a really fantastic supportive peer group that you can work with and learn from. It's really interesting for us to be a studio provider as well as designers of studios, because it gives us a real insight into what people need and how people work. We notice, for instance, how busy the makerspace is at the times that actually our own office is really quiet. So that's in the evenings and the weekends. And that speaks to both the fact that these are emerging practitioners who are working in the space mainly, and also people who have other jobs, because it's not necessarily sustainable to be able to be an artist practitioner full-time and make your living that way. At this point in time, it's a very precarious way to work. And what's really fulfilling is to see artists start off as members in the makerspace and then graduate to other studio provision in the area. So there are several studio buildings in the town that do provide self-contained studios, sort of more traditional studio spaces, and many of the makerspace members over the last few years have started to move on and be able to kind of consolidate their practice from those beginnings. So that's a model that I think is becoming increasingly prevalent in the world as a response to both the scarcity of space, the expense of space and equipment, and also the fact that people are juggling jobs and lives with their studio practice, and that doesn't necessarily sustain a self-contained studio. I'm going to move on to the next project, which is the next most recent project actually that we completed as studios, which also speaks a little bit to some of the current models of studio provision. This is a SPACE Studios project in Redbridge Town Hall in Ilford town centre. This is a kind of classic 21st century, early 21st century model of studio provision, whereby the local authority has this amazing grade 2 listed town hall in which many spaces became redundant or not needed for the council functions, and they looked to the creative practice and the creative world to provide some solutions for that space, as well as to try and diversify and enliven in some ways the town as a whole, the town centre as a whole, through the introduction of creative activity and artistic work. So this is a sort of long meanwhile project where we worked with SPACE, and it will be in operation for, well, originally about 5 years. It'll probably keep going for a little bit longer. And it's a classic one where we're using a space that's actually really quite awkward. It's not an easy space on many levels to convert to studio use. It's the old library spaces on the ground floor for the town hall, and then it's 2 floors of studios on some of the upper levels within the Grade 2 listed building, all of which were in a fairly derelict or semi-derelict space when we looked at them. This is just a few shots of the space now. What's really interesting and lovely about the space here is that it's not just studio spaces, there's also gallery space and project space. And in fact, SPACE, or the organisation, moved their own programme team into this building alongside the artists. So there's a constant presence there from the programme team who run outreach activities and education activities, as well as the gallery programme here. And I think in many ways, this saves the project from being a squeezing of artists into space for which no other viable use could really be found. And I think there's something interesting but also problematic about the way that in the current environment, a lot of the spaces that artists are put into are the spaces for which no one else can find a real use. And because artists have and always have traditionally worked in very marginal and awkward spaces, it's quite an easy jump to say, well, artists can make use of any old space, so let's put them in any old space and that will be sort of fine. And it's a lovely building, and we were really glad to manage to restore quite a lot of the original features and layout of the space, celebrate some of the quite beautiful early 20th century features that are in the space, as well as some of the older parts of the building. This is the gallery space on the ground floor. It houses a real variety of artists of all sorts. It's very, very simply converted with partitioning that doesn't always even run full height in the spaces, as you can see, because some of the spaces are really big. And now has a huge variety of different artists working on the different levels, making their practice there and working in the project spaces and so forth. And it has a real richness and a real life to it, because spaces that are occupied by artists always do. I mean, there's nothing so wonderful as sending your photographer to go and photograph artist studios once the artists have moved in, because there's always something absolutely wonderful and surprising about the way that they use the space. They're crowded spaces, they're cluttered spaces, but they're spaces that are really intensively and fully occupied from something that is quite neutral and bare to start with. It becomes absolutely full of life. But I think, you know, it's interesting that our most recent projects are all about repurposing of quite awkward buildings and less about purpose-built artist studio space. And as I go back through the other projects I'm going to show, they get gradually more and more purpose-built, even though they're the older projects in our portfolio. The next one I'm going to talk about is Gasworks. Gasworks is a wonderful organisation in South London near the Oval. And in about 2015, I think it was, they had the opportunity to buy the freehold of their building. It was originally actually started by artists, and the building was continued to be owned by one of the founders, and then the charity got the opportunity to buy it off that founder owner and raise enough money to undertake a really comprehensive refurbishment. Gasworks occupies this ex-industrial building, which used to be stores and managers' accommodation for the gas holder site, which you can see behind the building. And what's again wonderful about Gasworks is that this building has a real variety of things in it. It has gallery space, it has a really active community education and outreach programme, and then it has 2 floors of studios for both permanent tenants and also residencies that are 3-month residencies for artists who come mostly internationally through the Triangle network, which the Gasworks is a key partner in. And they come and they can spend time here working in the space. And one of the key things in the brief for our project here was to bring all of those aspects of the building together. The building used to very much feel like 2 floors of studios, completely disconnected and divorced from the gallery space and the education and community work that the team would be doing on the ground floor. It actually had 3 different doors into the building, so you could be coming to the exhibitions and have no idea there were any studios upstairs. You could be participating in a community projects and have no idea there was a gallery space or studios either. So the project that we did, the design work that we did, really very simply opened out the building and rationalised the floor plans to provide more usable square footage without actually increasing the physical size of the building in the slightest, because it was completely landlocked. Gasworks really shows some of the very delicate decisions that get made in the design of studio spaces. On the one hand, it's incredibly efficient. Really, every square foot matters. It's really important to get as much space for artists as you possibly can. But on the other side, the sense of artists being part of a community is really important. And that's a really interesting and delicate balance. And I think sometimes that's one that can be quite misunderstood, particularly by organisations or clients who are outside of the artistic world or the studio sector. Because on the one hand, artists do want to be part of a community and to feel like they're amongst like-minded people. On another level, studio work is really private. It's important that your space feels safe to yourself, that you don't feel that you're on display, that you can shut your door and do what you want to do in peace and quiet, very, very undisturbed. And at Gasworks, it was really lovely and interesting to work with the team there and how they understood the needs of their artists. They've been running this building for 20, 30 years already, so they had a really good understanding of what their artists wanted. And there are very simple things from this project, which are also learnings that we took from the last project that I'll show you, which is actually our earliest studio project. Like how you sort of want to know when there are other people in the building, at the same time as you don't want people peering through your door at all times of day and night. And actually simple things like having glazed fan lights over the doors means that in the evening you can see which studios have people in them, because you know that the lights are on there. And if you do need somebody, or you need someone to talk to, or you're not sure if you should lock up or what it is that you might do, it's really easy for you to just know what's going on. Another thing that's really lovely about the space is that the old industrial building, and we used it very efficiently, and we weren't very precious about things like how partitions crossed beams or trusses in the roof. It is very much just making efficient spaces and letting people then use them however they want. So some of the spaces are really tall, some of them are lower. They have idiosyncrasies and ways that people can occupy them without trying to smooth out those anomalies, at the same time as not being contrived in any way. And one of the best things about the building is that we managed to create a little kitchen for the artists, which didn't exist before. That's something that really brought the building, I think, actually to life in a way that was very perceptive of the client to say this was a core part of their brief. As you can see, the kitchen is tiny. It sits at the end of the building, but it's just enough space. It's not just a tea point, you know, a kettle and a toaster where you can quickly make yourself a cup of tea. It has just enough space for people to actually just come and eat their lunch, sit together, as well as for some more organised occasions like you can see here, where artists can come together and talk or meet with curators or patrons. And a lot of the success of this is down to the fact that Gasworks' team are in the building here, and they have this wonderfully light touch way of curating and managing the way that space is used. The fact that they will be eating their lunch in the kitchen too, that the residency artists who come from abroad can come and sit and meet people without it feeling contrived or forced. And in its own way, it's quite a private space as well. It's not right in the centre of the building. It's not in the very busiest spot. It's actually right at the end of the corridor, and then it has this little terrace that leads out and looks over the gas holders at the back. And it brings the building together in a really interesting way. Those meeting points in a building are quite rare and quite precious, and I think it's something that, you know, we like to be able to include in the studio projects, at the same time as respecting that sense of privacy and not making them, in a way, the zoo where the artists are just on show to the street or they're on show to the general public. It's got to feel somewhere that feels like a little bit like a home. The final project that I'm going to show is the first proper studios building that we designed as architects, which is Artist Studios at High House Production Park, which is in Thurrock in Essex. It overlooks the Dartford Crossing and the industrial and warehousing landscape of Thurrock. You can just about see the Q2 bridge in the background of the picture on the right here. And in a way, it's a little bit ironic that the earliest project we did was actually the most purpose designed for artists' needs and drew on the most thorough research and understanding of artists' needs. The client here was Acme Studios. Acme started as an artist-led organisation like most studio providers do, and have been running a number of studios. They graduated from what we'd now call meanwhile use type projects, where they occupied housing that was scheduled for demolition prior to kind of big redevelopments in the East End in the 60s and the 70s. They then moved on to owning and managing some ex-industrial buildings, warehouse buildings, typical, again, sort of what people have in their mind's eye when they think about artist studios. And then they gradually evolved their model. So they were an early adopter of looking at Section 106 and agreements with private developers as a way of delivering studio space. So they would frequently take on the ground floor spaces or some of the more awkward spaces within commercial housing developments and use them for studios. And then this came along as an opportunity to do a new build project. And what was really fantastic about working with Acme on this project was that they had undertaken a really extensive body of research in the year or two prior to this commission, looking back at all of their studio buildings, interviewing their artists, all of their artists about their experience as studio tenants, and working in fact with Central St Martin's on a quite big research project to understand what that meant for the next generation of artist studios. So this building drew on all of that research very, very heavily and was incredibly rigorously and rationally designed. The way that the structure worked, the way that the grid of the building worked, the immense variety of studio sizes that were created within that, from the tiny 13 metre squared that you can see at the top of the drawing here, through to massive studios that were over 100 metres squared in size on the ground floor. And it was a really interesting process to work with them through the research that they'd done to understand what was important to artists and what should be prioritised here. And actually, if it's interesting for anyone, you can read a lot more about this in the book that they produced, which you can see here, and there's a little essay by ourselves about the building in here, about what we took away from that research and how we developed it. And one of the things that was most interesting was about the sort of image, if you like, the folk image in people's minds of artist studios versus what artists really cared about themselves and what made the space most functional. And I think the folk image of artist studios is in a way quite like the images of the 3 projects I've just shown previously. Repurposed buildings, often ex-industrial buildings, a kind of quite charming and sort of idiosyncratic mess of creative practice inside a slightly, sometimes shabby interior. But actually what the research showed and what the interviews with the artists showed was how it was important that buildings worked functionally for them. And the image of the building was in no way important. In fact, the more anonymous, the better. What was really important was the functionality. And this developed into an incredibly clear brief for what the studios in this building would be like. That encompassed lighting, window placement, floor to ceiling heights, wall materials, floor materials, how plug sockets and utilities were located, and acoustics, actually, very, very importantly, how quiet was really important. the ability to be able to play your music really loudly if that was what was important to your work, and not disturb your neighbour next door who might want to work in dead silence. How, yes, daylight is important, but actually privacy is really important too. So most of the studios have clear story windows as a way of getting really good daylight penetration into the space, but allowing that privacy. And then smaller picture windows like you can see here, whereby if you want to just paste a piece of paper over that because you really don't want anyone looking in, you can just do that without compromising your daylight. And it's just amazing to see how these spaces ended up being used by artists. And really for the rest of the slideshow, I'm going to show the sort of before and the after, so that the building as it was completed, and then when we were lucky enough to have a fantastic photographer called Hugo Glendinning go back a few months later when all the artists were in their spaces to show how they got used in practice, from really quite kind of extreme, mad constructions being made in these really big ground floor studios, these extraordinary installations. How these big kind of robust ground floor units allowed people to bring in things like cars or garden sheds as part of their artwork into their studio space. How industrial a lot of the practices that goes on in the spaces, working, woodworking, spraying, all sorts of things, again, enabled by the fact that these spaces were big enough and well serviced enough to allow those sorts of practice to take place in a way that is really difficult in a space where your floors are made of wood, your walls aren't robust enough, you don't have the services and the utilities to manage that. And also even the smaller studios, so this is one of the smaller first floor studios, how they become occupied by artists, how people choose to locate their equipment, furnish their spaces, and use all sorts of different equipment. And, you know, it really brings home this question of how a studio is, for most artists, more important than their house. It is the safe space, it is the permanent space, it is the space where they can shut the door and not have to share it with anybody else. In a time when, you know, many people are living in quite precarious housing conditions, very insecure tenancies, often shared and quite cramped flats with others. The studio spaces are spaces where people feel safe and protected and have the freedom to do whatever they want. And all of the design is really aimed at making that happen. It's not about the image of the studio or the kind of romance of the studio. It really is about providing something that's safe, robust, practical space, fully flexible for how people want to use it. And, you know, it is something to be said that whilst we do have this image of the marginal artists in the sort of freezing garrets and the warehouses, actually the purpose-built space is incredibly important. And I think it is a little bit of a shame that we don't value that a little bit more at the moment, that it is, we had this brief moment where we did this project, and I think Acme's hope and our hope was that it was going to be the first of more new build studio projects, that it could provide an exemplar for other organisations, other sites, to say, you know, this is something that we can do. This building was built unbelievably cheaply. It was the cheapest building we've ever done, cheaper than repurposing another building in actual fact. It's much, much cheaper than, for instance, even Gasworks, which was a refurbishment of a shell, or any of the other buildings. Probably not quite cheaper than Redbridge, because that was extremely light touch, but it was nonetheless less than £1,000 a metre squared at the time, which is pretty extraordinary. But sadly, despite all of that cheapness and efficiency and real focus on brief, it hasn't been the start of a new generation of new build studios. We're still being asked all the time to do more repurposing, which is great. And, you know, it's important to find space for artists wherever they are. But it is an interesting thing to reflect on, I think, that perhaps we're valuing artists more for the image of the artist than what the artists themselves really want to see. This building actually included live spaces as well. It included work live units, which took on a very similar approach to the studios themselves. This is a picture of one of them before the occupiers moved in. They really are just a big studio with a kitchenette and a bathroom and a bedroom attached. And they were actually incredibly oversubscribed. It was a bit of a gamble. People sort of thought, well, does any artist really want to go and live in a work-live studio kind of on the edge of an industrial estate in Thurrock? But the answer was lots of people really did want to do that, which was really, really interesting in its own right. The building that we produced at High House doesn't in many ways look like anything like anyone expects an artist studio's building to look like. It's really functional and robust. The materials are very basic. They're the common London flattened bricks that are mostly used, for structural purposes or internally and plastered over and never really seen. We use them just naked here, and very inexpensive aluminium profiled cladding, basically just shed cladding, and very simple buildings. And actually the wonderful thing was we also got to do a full post-occupancy survey here of the artists a year or two after they'd moved in, and how much they enjoyed being in the space was really fantastic to hear. They were glad to actually have a building that was quite anonymous, that didn't put them on show. They didn't feel like they were a kind of artist zoo for the spectating of the wider public, or inserted as a way to sort of bring some crazy life and creativity to what would otherwise be a rather sort of bland commercial scheme somewhere in the centre of the city. And I think there are definitely some lessons there for how we look and value artists going forward, how we have that respect for what they contribute and create space that really works for them. It was a wonderful project to do, and we do hope that there will be more of these projects coming forward in the future. But until then, we'll keep making the best of all the repurposed spaces that we get offered in the meantime. Thank you.